Hello, and welcome to this episode of ECPG Live. We are discussing problem gambling, the state of the nation, and Washington State. My name is Tana Russell. I am Deputy Director of the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling based in Washington State. And we are live streaming to Facebook and YouTube Live, and this is viewable on demand afterward. You are more than welcome to leave comments or ask questions of the guest. Just please remember that this is not a confidential platform, so only share what you are comfortable sharing publicly. And with that, I would like to welcome our guests. I am joined today by Cait Huble. She is the Director of Communications of the National Council on Problem Gambling. And I'm also joined by Roxane Waldron. She is the Problem Gambling Program Administrator with the Washington State Healthcare Authority, Division of Behavioral Health and Recovery. Welcome both.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Cait, is there anything else you would like to share about yourself or your work in this field? Anything you'd like to share?
I'm so happy to be here today. Thank you for having me. Speaking on behalf of the National Council on Problem Gambling, just a reminder, gentle note that we are neutral on legalized gambling. So while we work with all sides of the industry, our focus really remains on mitigating harm prevention, and preventing problem gambling related harm.
Thank you. And Roxane, tell the viewers a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Tana. I'm really happy to be here today with you and Cait. I have been the administrator of the program for about 5 years. I've been with the Healthcare Authority. I'm the only person in my program. We have a small program currently, but I'll talk a little bit more about some exciting changes that are happening. And I want to echo what Cait said about our program is neutral also on gambling. And we are here to help people that are impacted negatively by gambling and problem gambling.
Well, thank you both for being here. So let's dive into some of the big news. In this field, the gambling industry, problem gambling, advocacy and awareness, things change very quickly. Every year, there's something changing. Some years it feels like it's by the month. So Cait, tell us, what do you think are the biggest highlights from the past few years, the biggest changes or news?
The biggest thing that we are responding to as an industry that is changing is the little thing called sports betting. As post 2018, we're kind of reacting, I think, as states legalize sports betting state by state, and we're all, I think, scrambling a little bit to build that social safety net to ensure that there are prevention and education and treatment resources available as that legalization comes online, and also making sure that there are tools available for people who are able to gamble safely and just keeping them in that responsible gambling area, and kind of balancing the education of that with mitigating risk. One of the biggest things we have done organizationally and across the country is rolling out one national helpline number and adopting 1-800-GAMBLER as the national problem gambling helpline number, and that will work across all 50 states. You can call, text, or chat that number, and really the goal with that is to make one very easily memorable number that you can reach out, you can get help 24/7, no cost, there's resources in your area, so that we can increase that number of people who need help for problem gambling and making it easier for them to access that help. Unfortunately, our earlier research has indicated only about 40% of Americans know where to get help for a gambling problem, and we're hoping to see that number increase just as much as the accessibility of being able to gamble on your phone has increased. So that's a big one for us, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit later, but chatting about some additional funding opportunities to ensure that every state is fully resourced when it comes to resources for prevention, education, and treatment.
And on the helpline, if someone does call, text, or chat to the helpline, can you give a brief explanation of what they might expect if they were to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is fully confidential, 100% private. Your call will be routed based on your area code. So it's not quite like 911 where we know exactly where you are. It'll be based on your area code. If you live in an area where your area code is out of state, you may end up getting transferred to another contact center so they're able to provide you resources local to you. Um, but what that is you'll call, you'll be asked some questions about your scenario. We want to make sure that you're safe, you're not in immediate crisis harm, and then offer what is available in your area and what tools you may need. Whether you are the person who's struggling with a problem or you are a loved one, those resources tend to vary. And so it's not a one size fits all approach, just like treatment and recovery are not one size fits all. We want to make sure that the resources you're being provided are helpful to you in the moment. I will say, if you are a loved one, if you're a parent, if you're a concerned friend, we invite you to call. The helpline is not exclusively for people who have a problem themselves, and we hope to be able to provide resources to anyone seeking those.
Thank you. And I'll add the Washington State Problem Gambling Helpline is 1-800-547-6133. Individuals can either call that or 1-800-GAMBLER. They will end up at the same call center getting these same resources. So no one needs to worry about which number is the right one. Call either. You are fine. You will be well cared for. There are translation services. And as Cait said, what is really nice is anybody can call it. If I'm concerned about someone in my family, I can call. I do not have to even get them on the phone. I can call, I can ask questions, I can get resources, and then I can decide what I want to do with those resources. And what's nice in Washington State is I can go use those resources myself. And the person who might be gambling in my family I'm worried about doesn't even need to be involved if it's not that time for it. So that's very, very cool. There is a real effort to eliminate barriers so that anybody who is impacted by it, whether it's their own or loved ones, can get access to that help.
Definitely. And just reinforcing that confidentiality. I know that's always a concern when you call.
Absolutely.
Potentially, if you are struggling yourselves, we aren't going to turn around and call your job or make the call public. It's absolutely confidential and private. We just want to make sure that you're able to get the help that you need.
Excellent. So let's talk news in Washington State. Roxane, what are some of the big changes that have happened in our neck of the woods over the last few years?
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about that. And I know, Tana, you've been integrally involved, so you will know this, but I think for some folks it will be new. So a couple of years back, the legislature decided that they really wanted to focus on problem gambling in our state. So that was new for us. And up to that point, the program had been around since 2005, mostly providing problem gambling assessment and treatment. And most of the funding was spent on that. And so when the state decided to form a problem gambling task force that looked at that, we met with our stakeholders and partners and tribes and other folks, agencies, to look at what are the services that the state provides and in general what's provided across the state. And so from that, the legislature really came to understand that problem gambling services, at least on the state level, may not always be meeting the needs that are out there. And part of that was prevention and awareness, which I know we're going to talk about a little more. But I'm excited to say that from that process, we found that legislators were willing to actually double the amount of funding in our program. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're going to use that funding. But that's super exciting on the problem gambling services side. I would say that, Cait brought up sports wagering. In 2021, legal sports wagering in tribal casinos became possible, and there are a number of tribal casinos that take advantage of that and that do provide that. It's not, strictly speaking, they don't consider it online gambling. We don't have legal online gambling in our state right now. It is at the tribal casinos, it is geo-fenced, which means that you would maybe be using a mobile app for it. You would be signing into their particular service, but you couldn't use it off the premises. And so the premises might include, a gas station across the street and the hotel and, of course, the gambling floor. But then you couldn't take it beyond that. So in a sense, even though you are using mobile, you are also limited to that location. So that is different than like online sports wagering or commercial sports wagering. So right now there is that distinction. We did a prevalence study in 2021 with adults that looked at the uses of the various kinds of gambling, and that was right before sports wagering in tribal casinos became legal. And so when we do our replication study in a few years, we'll be able to see, if people are feeling an impact from that. We definitely are aware at our program that because of the ubiquitousness of sports wagering is everywhere. You can see it advertised on any game that you go online. Even if you're doing something completely different, it might be available. And so we just want to make sure that in the same way that opportunity is available, whether it's legal or not, that the services are available, people know how to get them. So I would say that that's kind of the big news coming out of Washington State, just an awareness of sports wagering. And with that, and I'll talk about a little more, focus on youth and young adults. So thank you.
Yeah, perfect. And for those who don't know, you can access the prevalence studies online, public. Before the most recent one, our previous one was in the late 90s. So we were overdue for for a new prevalence study in Washington State. So glad we got that. Of course, the downside was the pandemic, and no one could predict what the impact of that would be and how long that would last. So I'm glad you mentioned the replication study because, of course, we're going to need some more data now that we're kind of past the closures of the pandemic, and now that we have sports betting in our state, we're going to see maybe some things quite different, or maybe not so different, but it'll be good to get that. So you can find those online. We have also had in Washington State, we had the Problem Gambling Task Force. We've since had a few work groups specifically around problem gambling. Some committees and other organizations and groups that are focusing more on the topic of problem gambling and integrating into prevention services, treatment services, recovery services. Speaking for ECPG, we've definitely seen an increase in training requests, both at an organizational level to come train providers and on a broad level, both within and outside of Washington State and across the country. And I hope that's a good sign, that awareness is going up. Maybe it's a sign that the awareness is because of the boom of sports betting in the US, but it's nice to feel like I'm seeing a heightened sense of awareness over past years. All right, so let's talk about funding for problem gambling services. This is uncharted territory for some people because it is a little bit different than what people might be used to from the mental health and substance use side of things. So, Cait, let's start with you. And I know every state is different, but on a national level, what can you tell us about funding for problem gambling?
It's a pretty short answer from the federal level. The answer is what funding? It doesn't exist, unfortunately. There are $0 of federal funding allocated to problem gambling, compared to substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder. Those addictions get billions of dollars from the federal government through line items, block grants through SAMHSA, and unfortunately, we are far behind in the funding department. NCPG has worked very diligently with our stakeholders across the country, and we do have a bill in Congress called the GRIT Act, and that is legislation that would utilize 50% of the federal excise tax on sports betting and reallocate that to prevention, treatment, education, research via SAMHSA block grants back out to the states. There are 6 states and DC that still have $0 of state funding for problem gambling services. And so there's certainly a lag both at the federal level and even to some of the state levels that are, especially DC, has legalized sports betting, is absolutely generating those revenues, and has since eliminated the problem gambling budget. So certainly concerning in terms of building that social safety net, making sure that people are able to seek treatment and care if they develop a problem, but also we are optimistic. Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut and Congresswoman Salinas from Oregon have been sponsors of the GRID Act, and we hope to see that move forward in future sessions.
And what does GRIT stand for?
I knew you were going to ask me this. I have it.
I think I got it. It's Gambling, Addiction,
yes.
Recovery, Investment and Treatment
Act. Yes.
Yep. Well, we will look forward to hopefully seeing it circle back around in the next legislative session. So those who follow that, there's you an act to follow, and hopefully it will pass and get the first federal funding.
It's still active this year. If you are interested in advocating for GRIT, you're welcome to call your senator, to your congressperson, and encourage them to support that.
Excellent. Thank you. And so, as Cait said, there is no federal funding, so each state works out the funding for problem gambling within their state. So Roxane, can you tell us a little bit about how that happens in Washington?
Yeah, so as you said, each state has to decide, first of all, if it's going to fund problem gambling, and secondly, how it's going to fund problem gambling. And so each state is really unique in how it chooses to do that. For example, in Oregon, our sister state, it's funded through a 1% contribution from revenue from the lottery. So that is how they do it. In our state, our legislators have since 2005 required that a very small portion of the business and occupation tax on commercial gambling, the lottery, and that includes house bank card rooms, and also charity gambling above $50,000 in revenue, and horse racing, that they are required to contribute about, it was up until recently about 1/6 cent on the dollar, and now it's going to be, we're working up in 2 steps from the legislation that passed last year to increase it to about 1/3 cent on the dollar, which is going to double our funding in our program. The tribes also contribute problem gambling revenue a portion, and I think you're going to talk about that a little bit, Tana, how that works. They are not required to provide any funding to the state problem gambling program. However, some choose to do that, and that's very helpful. I would say the commercial gambling in our state is about 20% of the gambling, and the other 80% takes place in tribal casinos. So that's just the split in terms of how gambling happens and where funding is coming from for different kinds of activities. So so the amount that we're getting, before we were kind of in the bottom like third nationally for those states that had programs in terms of what we were spending per capita, per person, per adult at the state. And now we've moved up to be more in the middle range. So we went from about 9 cents to about 20 cents per capita. And the gold standard programs that are very well funded, such as Oregon and Massachusetts and a couple others, they tend to be up in the, $1 or $1.50 per individual. And so we still have a ways to go to get there. However, I would also point out that because the tribes are also contributing, but that's not being counted into that number, we are closer up to, closer to like 50 or 75 cents if you include the tribal funding that's coming in. So they're contributing probably the majority of the money for problem gambling in our state for services. And so the other thing that's really exciting, is this be a good time to talk about Medicaid? Okay.
Yes, please go right ahead.
So even though there is no federal funding, there are a few states, and I think we were the 4th state, that has applied to this Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, to include problem gambling assessment and treatment under the substance use disorder section of Medicaid. And so it's just an easy way to do it, even though we know that problem gambling kind of falls in both areas, mental health and SUD, substance use disorder. But this was sort of an easier pathway, and I think it's what the other states have done as well. And so that just started on January 1st, and that means that all of our Medicaid eligible people, Medicaid enrolled, can actually now receive problem gambling treatment. It's covered. And the great part about that is that takes less money than out of the state problem gambling program to pay for treatment. and assessment if folks are covered by Medicaid. And so we're finding that we estimated to be about 20% of our clients were actually Medicaid eligible, but it's looking like it might even be a higher percentage depending upon the agency. And one agency over in Spokane has moved 50% of their clients off of the state problem gambling treatment fund for free treatment and assessment over to Medicaid. And so the Medicaid piece, there's a federal component and state component. And so that's a really wonderful and new change. And I hope that other states will be able to sort of use that path. And then hopefully when the GRID Act passes in the future, there will be funding that will also come in from the SAMHSA mental health and substance use disorder block grants that states can use for prevention and awareness activities and so forth. So I'll stop there. It is a little bit complex when you involve the federal government in anything, but we'll take the money. So hopefully that will happen. Hey, whatever reports they need, we'll do them.
Yes. Yeah. I'll just give kind of a snapshot. So for treatment services, if anyone is looking to get counseling or therapy services for whatever degree of gambling related harms you're experiencing, it doesn't matter if you feel it's mild or temporary to severe and years long. There is private insurance, which does cover outpatient treatment. As Roxane mentioned, we now have Medicaid. Woo! With some limitations, but Medicaid. There is tribal funding, and most of the behavioral health programs among tribes who do gambling treatment, it is free or low cost, and most of them will serve both tribal and non-tribal members. There is the state funding and ECPG. We also get funding from various sources, most of it from the tribes, and we are able to use some of those funds for outpatient if it is needed and isn't already covered by one of those other things. And we can also use some of those funds for residential treatment. Now, where do people go for residential treatment in Washington State? Well, at the moment we're recording this, there is not right now residential treatment beds for gambling disorder in Washington State. We hope that will change at some point in the future. So we contract with a few providers outside of state in Oregon, Louisiana, Minnesota. So people may leave the state for residential treatment. Now, outside of treatment, there is also community groups such as GA, Gam-Anon, other gambling style recovery groups, tribal community groups and sweat lodges. There are programs such as Smart Recovery, recovery centers, and recovery cafes that are starting to integrate problem gambling more into their repertoire as well. And of course, there are online programs available to people, from apps to websites to self-help and you name it. There's several things out there. So that kind of covers the help services spectrum in a very, very brief nutshell. And just remember, there is help not only for those who are struggling themselves, but also for the family members. We mentioned this earlier, that a family member can call the helpline and get the resources. They can also access those resources and get counseling to help put their own life back together, even if the person who is gambling in their family never even knows about it or isn't interested in being involved in it. The family member can get help for themselves. So definitely want to make sure I make a plug for that.
So no one should ever be concerned about costs that deter them from seeking treatment.
Yes, that's the bottom line. And that's what I would hear all the time. Gambling related harms by their very nature tend to leave people broke, and treatment is an expense. And so I'm happy that in Washington State, we have so many different sources that recognize that and to help cover that for the individuals from the community level to the statewide level. All right, so where are we now in terms of increasing public awareness? And maybe compared to awareness of mental health or substance use disorders, where are we at? Roxane, do you want to start this one?
I can, but I'm kind of curious to hear, what Cait thinks on a national level first, and then maybe I can talk a little bit about
Let's start with Cait first.
My observations.
I have a very bright and sunny outlook. We're making progress, but there is certainly work to be done. I mentioned only about 40% of Americans even know how to seek help for a gambling problem. That's a step that we're obviously hoping to increase awareness of so that no one feels like they're struggling and completely isolated, stranded. We have also seen contacts to the national helpline increase. It's increased about 100% since 2020. However, I do want to caution people that does not necessarily relate directly to a prevalence number. It is certainly an indicator of risk increasing, but just because calls, contacts, text chats have gone up, that does not mean we have doubled our number of problems. We've seen risk increase about 30% from 2018 to 2021. Speaking of redoing studies, we have a new our Engage study coming out at the end of June, I hope, early July, with a state-by-state comparison of 2018, 2021, and now 2024. So we hope to see the awareness of resources, especially the responsible gambling resources that organizations provide on their platforms, to have increased, and the shame and stigma around problem gambling, which is something the industry's our side is constantly battling, of explaining that chemically gambling addiction is very much the same as substance use disorder. In your brain, it's the exact same thing, and so it's a lot harder to understand on a, I think, sociological level when there's no substance to tie to that. And so from a understanding of addiction level, I think we're a bit behind the other addictions, just because it's a little bit harder to materialize, comprehend that it's not a substance that you're directly tied to. And I think that understanding and that shame and stigma has held back the development of both the public understanding of gambling addiction and also some of the medical accessibility for treatment. But we are seeing improvements in that. More people are recognizing that it is a disorder, just like any other addiction. It's not a moral failing. And hopefully with that, there are more people willing to seek treatment. Problems don't get as severe, and there's less of a stigma around seeking treatment and moving into recovery. So people don't feel quite so isolated.
Yeah, thank you. It's I used to say it felt like it was behind the awareness of alcohol use disorders by about 50 years. I think heightened awareness around video gaming and the overlap of gambling elements inside video games, plus the increase of sports betting and sports betting ads, has probably increased awareness quite a bit over the last 5
Probably
years.
5 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say
Yeah.
good or bad, that has definitely
Yeah.
shined a spotlight on gambling addiction.
Yeah, absolutely. Roxane, what have you seen? Where do you feel we're at now in terms of public awareness?
Well, when we did our 2021 prevalence study, we also asked some questions about attitudes and behaviors and knowledge about services. And what we found in the knowledge about services was that of those that answered the question, which is only about half of the folks that took the survey, that specific question around what services do you know about, the most significant amount of folks knew about the helpline. They didn't necessarily know about Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling, which sponsors it in Washington State, but they did know about the helpline. That was the number one thing. And then in terms of did they know about the Washington State Problem Gambling Program? Did they know about the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling? Those actually were pretty low. And so I think people had some awareness of, if there's a problem, here's how you get help. But they didn't necessarily know what organizations they could approach directly. I know, Tana, that we have talked about within our partnership, that there's no wrong door. People can call us directly. They can call the helpline, but if they want to call us directly, they can, and we will help them. And that does sometimes happen in the state problem gambling program. And so I feel like that is increasing a bit more, that people are actually reaching out more for help. So that makes me think that there, a couple things could be going on. Maybe people are experiencing a greater severity and want to get help. Or maybe they're just aware that help is there. And I think it could be both. And I think one of the things that we found challenging around public awareness is there's kind of a catch-22 in that you want to build capacity. But if you don't, but then when you try to explain, to administrators and others at the state level that you want to build capacity for folks because you know that the need is out there, they will say, well, where are the lines? Where are people, lined up out the door? And the problem is if they don't know that there's services, they're not going to be lined up out the door. So having the prevalence study is super helpful because we found that actually there is of adults that gamble, 3.5% of them are at risk for, moderate to severe problem gambling. And that was on the high side for the states, I believe. And then for youth, when we look at youth numbers through our Healthy Youth Survey and others, we know that they're at double the risk. And that's another thing that I feel like we have to deal with in terms of awareness. I've had to deal with it doing a lot of education within my own agency for people to understand, because when they think about youth gambling, they are like, well, youth can't go into casinos, or, they have to be 18 or 21, depending on the location. They can't buy lottery tickets. So this really isn't a thing. It's like, no, it really is a thing because they can carry around in their pocket 24/7 gambling and gaming that often has elements of gambling. And so that's been a real education that I've been working with folks and learning from you also, Tana, and then sharing that back, because you're also a certified gambling counselor. So you have that background as well, the clinical side. People in my agency are finally just this year saying like, oh, we're doing this thing and we want to call it this, but is that the right language? Because maybe that evokes gambling. So I feel like that education part is happening within our agency. And I feel like we need to take that to scale and have it be happening more in other agencies and also across our state. So as we build capacity, and we have more money to spend on advertising our services, in connection and in collaboration with the Evergreen Council, we will build awareness. And I do think that you're right that just the number of ads that are out there and everything, people are like, I guess this is really a thing now, like micro, gambling every moment on how this play is going to go or what's going to happen with that, instead of just placing one bet on one game. So I feel like all of that is really important. I don't feel like we've done the work completely yet. I feel like we're getting a better understanding of what the work is, and we are planning how to do that work more effectively. And I know ECPG, you've been doing that for a long time. So it's the state program is, we're working on integrating with other prevention and other units within our agency and other sister agencies to work on how we can get that information out there. So that's kind of a long answer to the public awareness, but I feel like all of those things are components of it. And I feel optimistic too. Having more money, I feel much more optimistic actually for we can spend on this. So.
Excellent. And yeah, I'm hoping that the increase in funding and hopefully eventually federal funding will help support research. And while we do have quite a bit of research in this field, dating quite a ways back, there's still, it's a field that changes so fast. We don't really know what are the rates among youth in post-pandemic and loot box gotchas, streamers streaming their gambling era, right? There's just so much we don't know that we need research on to help support these services, to help support the providers, to help support the individuals. And as Cait said, helpline data gives us interesting data, but it doesn't give us prevalence. There's so many forms of help services that people will reach out to within their cultures and communities and religious organizations that are not going to be reflected by helpline data, though that's helpful. And what we do have data on is people tend to suffer from gambling related harms for 6 to 10 years before they end up reaching out for help, and then they may even encounter barriers at that point that then further extend how long it takes them to get the help that they need from trained specialists who know what they're dealing with. Prevention wise, We are not there yet, though I've seen some positive progress, right? We don't have responsible gambling awareness of risks taught in middle school and high school programs the way we do for substance use awareness and risks and responsible behavior or safe sex. It's just not on par with those programs yet. Though I have been able to work with a number of different prevention individuals and organizations and programs who are seeing gambling and gaming among the populations that they're working with on both a large scale and a youth specific scale, and wanting to integrate problem gambling into that. Some of the barriers I feel like I'm seeing with that not happening quite yet is sometimes funding. Funding might come with restrictions that it's only for alcohol, tobacco, other drugs, or mental health, etc. And so they might worry about, making sure the funding's being used within the restrictions, or they don't have someone who knows enough about problem gambling to integrate it into their programs. But I'm seeing people who are actively trying to reduce both of those barriers so that it can be integrated in primary prevention programs and in youth-specific prevention programs, which I think will help long-term on some of those longitudinal studies. So hopefully over the next 10 years, we may actually see some evidence of some things being prevented as the current younger generation ages. The other thing that is unique about this, and that I think I've seen some heightened awareness of, is not just that gambling can be addicting sometimes, but that it can also be deadly sometimes. And we know that problem gambling disorder studies, the suicide attempt rate generally hovers around 20%, which is incredibly high compared to other conditions studied, like substance use disorders and other mental health conditions. So I think I've seen awareness of that go up. So why we might have a low prevalence rate in terms of a single health condition, addictive disorder being studied, we do have a high rate of it being a seriously life-threatening concern. So I think I've seen awareness of that go up, which is also heartening. So positive outlook. What else are your hopes for the future? With gambling and certain things that hit the news sometimes it's kind of dreary, it's kind of gloomy, it's kind of, you know how news goes. But looking towards the future at all the things we've kind of talked about so far, what are your hopes that could come? And either of you can go first on this one. Please feel free. Jump in there.
Why don't I go first, because then maybe you can wrap us up with the national level. Hopefully there's hopes at the national level. There are in Washington State for sure. I feel like the fact that legislators understand better now that this is an issue that needs to be in front of them. They need to consider. We've had some great legislative champions. Our bill that passed last year actually was passed in a bipartisan way. And it was amazing how quickly it went through and how much everybody understood that this was an important topic. So the big piece of that, though, that's coming out of that funding is, as you talked about, prevention, awareness, and expanding that. And I feel really excited about that. Tana, I know you have ECPG is one of the members on our problem gambling prevention work group. That is a short-term believe it or not, a committee that will actually end next year. It's just for short term to do a specific job. And its job is to work with our partners and our other agencies and other folks that are playing in the same field, that are in the same sandbox around problem gambling, but also around prevention, to come up with a statewide plan that will be able to be integrated with the other types of risky behavior prevention activities that are happening, both within the Healthcare Authority, my agency, and also with our partners. So that's super exciting. And I know that what we've identified is that within the Healthcare Authority, they primarily focus anyway on most of their prevention is focused on youth and young adults. And so that is probably where we will mainly focus, at least initially, at the Healthcare Authority. And I know that the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling has also been working in that space for a long time. So we have a lot to learn from you. And And so one of the requirements of that bill was to integrate our program into that, our other agency work on prevention. And then another piece of that I'm excited about is that we have some additional funding to do workforce development initiative, which we've launched with the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling, who do most of the training in our state for certified gambling counselors. And so that's really exciting because you've been doing that work and kind of carrying that all by yourselves, right? And so now the state has some funding to support that work too. And so we found when we looked at the overall in the Problem Gambling Task Force that we need more certified gambling counselors around the state, both regionally. We have many parts of the state. I think we identified 11 or 12 parts of the state where we don't have a certified gambling counselor within an hour. And by our statutes, a person will hopefully be treated by a certified gambling counselor, somebody who actually understands the scope of that and how that is a little bit, it's different from SUD and mental health, although it certainly overlaps with substance use disorder and mental health. So that's exciting. And so we're looking at three things regionally, as I mentioned, and then also looking to recruit and train clinicians who are coming from communities that may be at higher risk for problem gambling. Possibly BIPOC communities, communities where people are speaking primary language other than English. We sort of have identified that we need to actually increase the number of clinicians that we have available to meet people where they are. So that's another piece, and I'm super excited about that. And then the third thing I'm excited about is about this increased funding for research and data. So for example, you mentioned we need more data on what's going on with youth and young adults, especially and older folks too. I mean, regular adults or whatever. But it's really difficult with youth because it's challenging to run a survey in the field. It has a lot of restrictions around it to protect youth, obviously. So we're actually looking at running a youth panel study in the fall, which would be a much less expensive but very targeted study online with youth who can give us information about what they're doing. So it's less looking at prevalence and more looking at behaviors and what kind of stuff are they engaging in and what are their concerns and what are their beliefs. And then for young adults, we're actually taking our 2021 study and excerpting information about young adults ages 18 to 25 so that we can understand and have a baseline for that when we do our studies later to see how they're specifically doing. Because we know that for young adults, they're also at double the risk of the general adult population for problem gambling. And a lot of them have really gotten into sports wagering. They're often betting on things that are happening at their colleges or other colleges. And then my final thing I would say is that I'm excited because we're going to double the size of our program, not only in terms of funding, but also in terms of staff. We'll be hiring an additional person who will have a focus on prevention, but also be able to help with some of the other tasks of the program, which will really enable us to move beyond where we have been. So I'll stop there. Lots of stuff to be excited about.
You can keep going. If you have more, that's all great things to celebrate. I certainly can't object to any of it.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think I can echo a lot of that. I think optimistic. We've made a lot of good progress in the last 3 to 5 years, as Tana mentioned. I think that all signs are pointing in the right direction of we're moving into a space where people are aware that gambling is a risky behavior. Slowly but surely, we're building those consumer guardrails, and then as well as that consumer safety net for people who develop a problem. I think, and into the future, I hope to just continue to see that everybody knows where to seek treatment and that they don't feel any hesitation that they should seek treatment if it becomes a problem for them and they don't experience any friction in that process of seeking treatment, whether it be financial or stigma related. I hope to see that gambling continue to be part of the public health dialogue as we discuss mental health disorders and substance use disorder, things like that. It's just a part of the regular vernacular that problem gambling is included in the conversation. And I'm also optimistic that we will get to a point where youth are raised with a lot of additional prevention and education messaging, that it's not you turn 18, you turn 21, and suddenly you have this whole new world opened up to you. We have understood that there are risks. We understand how to safely set limits and where triggers may be, and how to balance it as an educational opportunity with, okay, this is my entertainment time and this is my entertainment budget and I can do it. And then I can move on and spend time with my family or go to work or do my other hobbies. I think that takes a long time. And so day to day, for those of us in the field, it feels like a grind. But generationally, I think there are changes coming. And the questions we're getting are all fantastic, of people identifying, well, this advertising is maybe a problem, or loot boxes are coming up a lot. Should I be looking at this for my children? That doesn't happen overnight. And so I think we're on the right track. I am also optimistic to see the kind of responsible gambling environment change into maybe a little bit less PR and a little bit more behavior modification, as we learn and understand the consumers, what they respond to day to day. So overall, optimistic that I think that we can continue to do good work and overcome the barriers that have been in place for 50 to plus years. There's a lot of great people working in this space with great intentions, and I'm confident in their ability to do good work.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned responsible gaming. That was the next thing I was going to bring up. The gambling industry, be it casinos, lottery, card rooms, and all things. While we have seen an increase in types of gambling, access to gambling, advertisements, I think we've also seen some positive momentum in terms of the responsible gaming policies coming through the industry. Dolores left a comment in the chat that we're actually now seeing some rulemaking that is pushing some momentum towards RG messaging and marketing materials. And for those who aren't aware from the industry side of things, their responsible gaming policies and programs can include everything from policies against marketing towards those who are underage to gamble, for advertising how to play the games, the odds of winning the games, just basic gameplay kind of information, making that easily accessible to the guests or site visitors, be it a brick and mortar online site, voluntary self-exclusion programs, and even staff training for what to do if a staff member is concerned about a guest. How do they respond to that? Who do they tell? And what would that process look like? Which might include giving that guest some resources for the helpline or local community services in their area, and letting that guest know about these different programs they might have not otherwise heard of, and then they can choose what they want to do with those. So I think we've seen some good RG momentum as well. I'm hopeful about all the things that you guys mentioned as well. I think, I don't want to call it like a perfect storm because that sounds bad, but like a perfect like conglomeration of things are starting to come together, where we've got we now in Washington State have Medicaid. That's gonna, hopefully cause some great momentum in the treatment services side. We've got more general awareness nationwide happening. We've got more robust industry side services like the messaging and self-exclusion programs. I think we're starting to see it overlap into prevention programs, treatment programs, recovery services. So I think all these things combined, I hope to see some positive changes, some decreasing barriers, some increasing access to services, more things translated into more languages other than English. So more barriers for language and culture being reduced. So again, lots of work to go, and it does happen slow, but it's happening. And so thank you to you both for all that you do. I think you've certainly been a part of some of these changes that we've talked about. Thank you to those that I didn't get to have as guests on this episode today from tribes and other nonprofits and organizations across the country who have really put a lot of resources and manpower behind this cause. I'm also seeing an increase in providers saying, I'm seeing this in my practice. I want to be able to help people with this. So appreciate that. All right. I think we have left a bunch of resources for people in the chat, so they will stay there for you to access them. And you can always reach out afterward if you need resources or have a question you'd like to ask offline. And we hope that you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.